I remind everybody that this briefing is a public-facing event. A recording of the audio and video of the briefing will be made available to the press and public shortly after it concludes. I note that we invited our minority colleagues to the briefing, but they have declined to participate. As this is not an official committee activity, there will be no official record of this event. Any member who wishes to share any relevant statement, article, letter, or other item may do so by way of their office's communications methods. Members are reminded to keep their microphones muted unless you are speaking, at which time you need to turn your microphone and cameras on. Any members using a telephone, audio only, *6 will work to unmute and remute your phone. If anyone is experiencing any difficulty during the hearing, please contact the committee's IT director and directors, and you have their emails and addresses were sent out with the notice briefing. At this time, the clerk will conduct a roll call to get a sense of who is on the call. Members, please unmute and remute yourselves as appropriate. Madam Clerk.
Chairman Scott.
Aye. Present.
Mrs. Davis.
Present.
Mr. Grijalva. Mr. Courtney.
Present.
Ms. Fudge. Mr. Sablon. Ms. Wilson. Ms. Bonamici. Mr. Takano.
Present.
Okay. Ms. Adams.
Present.
Mr. Desaunier. Mr. Norcross. Ms. Jayapal. Mr. Morelli. Ms. Wild.
Present.
Mr. Harder. Mrs. McBath.
Present.
Schreier.
Present.
Ms. Underwood. Mrs. Hayes. Ms. Shalala. Mr. Levin.
Present.
Ms. Omar. Mr. Trone. Ms. Stevens.
Present.
Mrs. Lee.
Present.
Mrs. Trahan.
Present.
Mr. Castro. Mrs. Fox. Mr. Rowe. Mr. Thompson. Mr. Wahlberg. Mr. Guthrie. Mr. Byrne. Mr. Grothman. Ms. Stefanik. Mr. Allen. Mr. Smucker. Mr. Banks. Mr. Walker. Mr. Comer. Mr. Klein. Mr. Fulcher. Mr. Watkins. Mr. Wright. Mr. Muser. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Keller. Mr. Murphy. Mr. Van Drew. Chairman Scott, this concludes the roll call.
Thank you. In a moment, we'll hear. Did anyone miss the roll call? Thank you. In a moment, we'll hear from our distinguished experts, and after they finish their presentations, we'll open the floor for members to ask questions. Because I have a education and labor related conflict in the schedule, I'll ask our Vice Chair, Mr. Levin, to control the question period, and so he'll be prepared to recognize members for questions. Since we've had a number of these virtual committee briefings, Members should know that they will be recognized in order in which they seek recognition, not seniority. To that end, please indicate if you have a question in the chat box. For those using telephone with audio only, please have your staff indicate your members' interest in the chat box on your behalf. As a reminder, today's briefing is a 1.5 hours in length. It is imperative that members ask their questions succinctly and be considerate of other members waiting in the queue to ask questions. A chime will sound as a reminder that a member's time has expired. I'll now recognize myself for opening remarks. The COVID-19 pandemic has exacted devastating toll on our nation's workers. Since the pandemic started, roughly 42 million people have filed unemployment claims. For our economy to recover, unemployment workers and employers must be able to access our nation's workforce programs with the resources and support they need to re-enter the workforce and to retain workers. Unfortunately, our public workforce system is significantly under-resourced. That was the situation going into the pandemic, and it certainly hasn't changed since then, and it is not prepared to cope with the surge in demand from newly unemployed workers. Over the past decade, public workforce programs have seen a nearly 18% decrease in inflation-adjusted funding from the federal government. Economists are now projecting that between 30 and 42% of the jobs lost during the COVID-19 pandemic will not come back, meaning that millions of workers will need to find new jobs. In response, Congress has already taken steps to address the problem. Through the CARES Act, we appropriated $345 million for the National Dislocated Worker Grants, which are competitively awarded to states to help respond to mass layoffs. Unfortunately, while the Department of Labor has received over $700 million in requests, only $240 million has actually been awarded as of 2 months ago. More recently, the House passed the HEROES Act, which should invest about $2 billion in core workforce programs under the Workforce Innovation and Opportunities Act, better known as WIOA. However, recent history tells us that the enacted funding for workforce programs in the CARES Act and the proposed funding in the HEROES Act may not be enough. During the Great Recession, Congress invested nearly $3.85 billion in public workforce systems, while funding in CARES and HEROES had only totaled about $3.4 billion. Yet the challenges we face are even greater than a decade ago. The number of weekly unemployment claims during the COVID-19 pandemic, the number has been, and on average, nearly 6 times greater than the record set during the Great Recession over 10 years ago. Clearly, our workforce systems will need more resources to overcome the full scale of this crisis. This is why I introduced the Relaunching America's Workforce Act, along with Senator Patty Murray and many members of this committee. This bill dedicates $15 billion for state and local workforce programs and provides employers flexibility to keep workers on the payroll through strategies like worker training. It also adds funding for on-the-job training and registered apprenticeship programs to help workers develop skills for new jobs. Finally, as correctional facilities reduce populations in response to the pandemic, the bill dedicates funding for the Department of Labor's Reentry Employment Opportunities Program, as well as for adult education for adult facilities. I now want to yield to the Vice Chair of the Committee Congressman Andy Levin of Michigan's 9th Congressional District, to introduce our experts and lead today's briefing. He'll be taking over as of now. As you all know, Congressman Levin has been a leader in our efforts to strengthen workforce programs, drawing from his experience as the director of Michigan's workforce system. Mr. Levin.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I really appreciate you holding this critical briefing today, and I'm honored to co-lead it with you. I cannot overstate the importance of workforce development in a healthy economy. In an unhealthy economy, as we have now, with a 14.7% official unemployment rate, which we know is many percentage points higher if you include discouraged workers, involuntary part-time workers, and so forth, and with a global pandemic hamstringing so many people's ability to either go back to work or get jobs, workforce development programs are simply essential. Meaningful workforce development will not only put people to work, but will enable them to embark on meaningful career paths with vital new skills, training, and education. We have a workforce system already in place that can facilitate this. And I'm a proud co-lead of the Relaunching America's Workforce Act, along with so many colleagues on this briefing. This will fund valuable training and education programs, as well as supportive services to get this country's economy back up and running. Again, I thank the chairman for his leadership, and I thank the panelists for joining us. Today, we are joined by Yvette Chocolat and Nicole Girard Freeman, who will help us identify the solutions we must consider to help unemployed workers get back on their feet. Yvette Chocolat is the policy director of the National Association of State Workforce Agencies, or NASWA. She assists state workforce agency leaders address labor market issues, including unemployment and the need for skilled labor. She helps direct two committees, the NASWA Labor Market Information Committee and the NASWA Employment and Training Committee. Nicole Girard Freeman joined the City of Detroit as Executive Director of Workforce Development and Detroit at Work in 2019. She brings more than 20 years of experience in the corporate, nonprofit, and entrepreneurship sectors to this role, which involves building an organization that supplies ready talent to employers and solving for often complex job and career readiness needs of local residents by leveraging Detroit's network of service providers. I know from my personal involvement in the Michigan and national workforce policy communities that Ms. Girard Freeman is a rising star in creating the truly just and effective workforce policy America will need going forward. Thank you both for your time today. I now want to turn it over to Ms. Chocolat to share a few words, and after that, we'll hear from Ms. Girard Freeman and then take questions. Ms. Chocolat.
Thank you so much, Chairman Scott and Vice Chairman Levin and members of the committee for inviting NASWA to the conversation today. And hello to Ms. Girard Freeman, my fellow panelist. I'm really looking forward to hear what you have to say from the field. 54 state and territorial workforce agencies are members of NASWA, and we're a nonpartisan, consensus-driven organization. The state workforce agencies administer three main strategies to help workers and businesses succeed through economic and labor market transitions. So the first is unemployment insurance, which is not our primary focus today. The second is workforce development services for job seekers, which include job search and career services, training, and connections to other programs and supports. And then third, labor market and career information, which provide the state and local level intelligence to support all those activities. Some of our agencies also administer other important workforce partner programs such as TANF, SNAP, vocational rehabilitation, and adult education. The workforce services we're focusing on today are provided through more than 2,400 local American job centers, and many of the services and the labor market information are also provided online, especially during the pandemic. So I'm going to give a quick overview of the current situation and challenges out there based on what we're hearing from our members. In the first few months of the pandemic, the majority of the job centers have been closed, and many of the state workforce services staff are temporarily helping to process UI claims. So states and their local partners have continued to provide employment and training services virtually, albeit at a reduced capacity. They're working hard to stand up enhanced virtual services and tools for customers, such as virtual job platforms, workshops, and free online learning opportunities as resources allow. And many state agencies have also been helping employers fill high priority positions in the economy, such as in logistics and healthcare, using new platforms that they've set up to match talent to business needs. So recently, the tide is shifting, as I'm sure you're all aware, and some agencies and businesses are starting to get on a path to reopen. The state agencies are starting to move state workforce staff back to employment and training activities from UI, and some of the job centers are starting to reopen their physical footprint slowly, and others are on a path to reopen over the coming months. For reopening the centers, health and security are both really big concerns given the expected high demand and long lines. So managing that, those concerns will raise operational costs for sure. So one message today is that these agencies must prepare now to address a wide range of customer needs. Many of the job seekers coming to the system will be first-time dislocated workers, and as has been noted, some will find new positions relatively quickly or after a short training course, but it's expected that others will be unemployed for a long time. Meanwhile, many other customers had just gotten or were struggling to get a foothold in the economy before the pandemic and recession, and they have to remain a priority. To help guide their work, some states have joined multi-state data collaboratives to develop intelligence on how the downturn is impacting specific industries and workers, analyzing real-time UI claims data and segmenting it by different demographic characteristics. Agencies are also engaged in statewide planning processes with their local partners to diagram key work streams and prepare to mobilize resources. And they're reaching out to businesses and developing partnerships to support hiring needs. So as the agencies continue to plan and act, the workforce system, as has been noted, faces some huge challenges, expectations of extraordinarily high caseloads, significantly fewer federal resources than were available going into the Great Recession, and no direction on whether and when major supplemental federal funding will be available. Some state agencies are concerned about workforce staff reductions, and limited digital access and digital literacy for some customers raises equity issues for virtual service delivery. Another concern is making sure the system can expand into more virtual services, but that the services complement and don't substitute for critical staff-assisted services, which are proven effective for a wide range of customers. And finally, many states are hoping to modernize and integrate their back-end workforce case management systems. Sounds boring, but the goal is to give customers easier access to programs and supports, and program administrators the intelligence they need to improve their strategies and the long-term economic and employment prospects of their customers. To address all of these challenges, NASWA encourages Congress to support state and local workforce systems through legislation like Relaunching America's Workforce Act.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And now, Ms. Girard Freeman, we'd be delighted to hear from you.
Thank you so much. First to the chair, Congressman Scott, and to you, Congressman Levin, for your invitation to join today. We appreciate being able to share Detroit's perspective. As you may know, Detroit is one of 16 Michigan Works agencies, and so I will lift up perspective from the front lines in Detroit, but many of the concerns I share are shared across the network of Michigan Works agencies in the city. So as you've likely heard, a few cities were hit as hard by COVID-19 as Detroit, with a population that is more than 80% Black and with a pre-COVID-19 poverty rate of 33.4% citywide. The racial disparities and inequities that exist across this nation are under a spotlight in the city of Detroit. Now, more than 50,000 COVID-19 tests have been administered under the leadership of Mayor Duggan. And our daily stats show that of those tested, 65% of new cases are African-American and 82% of deaths are African-American. So the impact of COVID-19 on Detroit has been significant. Under the leadership of Governor Whitmer and Mayor Duggan, though, we have more than flattened the curve. We are actually starting to see the number of cases and deaths in Detroit drop as quickly as they rose. And we're encouraged by that. We can very clearly see what's next. The Great Recession of 2008 threatens to pale in comparison to the economic impact of COVID-19. And in Detroit, that means piling on to the long-standing economic inequities in our city. The recession that we are feeling now is compounded by the Great Recession of 2008. It stacks on top of the uprising in 1967 and the race riot of 1943. Now, we've made some great progress with Detroit's workforce infrastructure during the past 5 years, and we are so pleased to have the support of Congressman Levin as both a colleague and an ally in the work. We are better at blending and braiding funding so that every federal and state dollar is maximized. We've retooled the way we deliver services so that instead of 3 American Job Centers, which are called Detroit at Work Career Centers here, we have 8, which means that there is a center within a 3-mile radius of every neighborhood in the city. We've reset our partnerships with employers so that the local Workforce Investment Board, seated by the mayor, and is called the Mayor's Workforce Development Board, has C-suite executives and leaders of some of the largest and most influential employers in the metro area, in the city, and we dare say in the nation. And while we're accountable to the Department of Labor and the state of Michigan for WIOA and other performance metrics, we hold ourselves to a higher standard in Detroit. We don't just measure ourselves by the unemployment rate. We measure ourselves by the number of residents employed. So just before COVID hit in February of this year, our employed resident rate was at an all-time high of 231,000 residents. In April of 2019, we watched that number fall off a cliff, literally. The number of employed Detroiters dropped to 165,000. If you can imagine the employment trend line taking a 90-degree angle drop, it is literally watching employment in Detroit fall off a cliff. And that leads us to the question of funding. What do we need in Detroit to get ahead of and stay ahead of the economic impact that's bearing down on us? We need three things. Number one, we need maximum flexibility in how we spend funding locally. CARES was helpful in that regard. We look forward to putting the provisions for the healthcare worker provisions in CARES as an example into play in the city. Number two, we need broader, deeper investments. So transitional jobs, adult education and literacy, and community college and industry partnership grants are just three of the areas in Relaunching America's Workforce Act that would have significant impact in the city of Detroit. And then third, we need funding for a comprehensive set of strategies to help Detroiters get back on their feet. So in Detroit, we lead with data, and we're informed by our experiences at the front line, the voices of our job seekers, our employers, and our partners. And we know that Detroit's solutions will not work if we don't close the digital divide. We know that unless we make investments in re-entry employment opportunities, all the criminal justice reforms in the world will fall flat. In Detroit, we know what we need. We make it our business to know our community and to make our systems work better for the people and the employers that it serves. Your support is critical. Thank you again to the chair and vice chair and other members of this committee for the opportunity to share our frontline perspective from Detroit.
Thank you very much, Ms. Girard Freeman. And now, Chairman Scott, if you have time, I'd like to call on you to ask your questions. I realize you have to go off to another event. So if you're able.
I appreciate it, but I'm going to have to leave in about 1 or 2 minutes. So I'm not going to be able to ask questions, but I would like to thank our witnesses for their input. And I look forward to working with you and passing the bill so that you'll have funds to work with and trade our workers in the future. So thank you, Mr. Levin.
Thank you very much, Mr. Scott. All right, so then I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes. And I'll ask first a question of you, Ms. Girard Freeman. How will the economic downturn that we're facing impact individuals who are already facing unemployment or underemployment or are disconnected from the labor force? And what additional resources do cities like Detroit and its inner suburbs need to address those challenges?
Vice Chair Levin, thank you so much for the question. It is such an important one. So prior to COVID-19, Mayor Duggan asked us to put together a plan that would provide an opportunity for every Detroiter who wanted one. And at the time, the only way we could make sense of that, given the long-term disconnects in the city, was to put together a plan for the number of Detroiters who were unemployed officially by the stats. That was 17,000. And so prior to COVID-19, we had a plan to create an opportunity for every Detroiter, all 17,000 who wanted an opportunity, ranging from provisions like those that you've recommended and your co-sponsors have recommended in Relaunching America's Workforce. Measures like paying residents to complete their high school diploma on the path to post-secondary education. Measures like temporary work experiences, on-the-job training, a greater focus on incumbent worker training so that as incumbent workers move up, we can bring more Detroiters who are disconnected in. We need those measures more now than we needed them before COVID-19 because the impact of COVID-19 threatens those people even more.
Thank you. Let me ask Ms. Chocolat and you a question about this new bill. You know, the Relaunching America's Workforce Act includes additional funding for reentry employment opportunities and to support justice-involved youth and young adults and formerly incarcerated adults and former offenders during and following the COVID-19 national emergency. This funding will open opportunities like subsidized employment and transitional jobs. Given the pandemic and the recent First Step Act and the resultant release of individuals impacted by the criminal justice system from incarceration, these reentry employment opportunities seem especially important. So, Ms. Chocolat, how are states currently addressing these reentry employment opportunities during the pandemic, and what additional supports are needed from Congress?
First of all, reentry has been a high priority topic in discussions among the state employment and training directors over the last few years at our meetings. They've been wanting to learn how other workforce agencies are contributing to state and local efforts, what promising innovations are out there, what works, what seems to be working. Due to the interest, NASWA has hosted workshops for all of our members across all the committees at our last 3 annual workforce summits on reentry topics. I don't have information on how the pandemic is impacting this work for state agencies, but I know it will continue to be a priority. I'm very happy to gather some insights and information if you're interested. On the question of additional supports, you know, Wagner-Peiser funding helps support some of this work from the state workforce agency side. I can remember a couple of specific examples of how state workforce agencies were involved in the efforts. One agency being very excited about standing up a job center inside a prison, another showcasing a secure database for incarcerated citizens so that they could upload their resumes and search and apply for jobs prior to release. And that state was also helping individuals apply to remove restrictions that they face working in certain fields. So it's partly a funding issue. It's a lot of coordination, and I'm looking forward to hearing what our members are doing on this during the pandemic as well. It's very hard to get their attention because they've been so incredibly busy.
Right.
But I can follow up if you're
Thank you.
interested.
Yeah, if you want to send us more information, that'd be great. Ms. Girard Freeman, what would additional resources mean for returning citizens in Detroit? I mean, that was way back when I was running DLEG's workforce programs. It was a big focus, but we have a long way to go there, I know.
Yes, we do. Thank you for the question. And I've been remiss in not recognizing my fellow panelist, Ms. Chocolat. So greetings to you. It is nice to see you. I got to tell you, all the progress we've made in Detroit with returning citizens, from our programming inside facilities like the return to work, readiness for work efforts that we ran inside Ryan Correctional Facility, our connections with employer programs like DTE's program at Parnell. Like if we don't make the kinds of investments that you've named in Relaunching America's Workforce Act, if we don't make those kinds of investments, Congressman Levin, all the progress we've made threatens to be erased, frankly. There are more than 3,000 returning citizens who come back to the city of Detroit every year. We have the highest concentration of those who are being released in our city. And so without specific measures to address their reentry to employment, their readiness for work needs, this is talent. This is talent that the local employer community could take advantage of. It's about more than doing the right thing for the residents. It's also about doing the smart thing for employers.
Thank you so much. All right, well, many of my colleagues want to ask questions, so let me move right along to Representative Wild, my colleague from Pennsylvania. Representative Wild, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Levin, and thank you to Ms. Chocolat and Ms. Girard Freeman for being here with us on this for this very important discussion, especially as we move forward in the aftermath of COVID. We know that so many of our distressed communities that were distressed long before COVID, are suffering the most from the fallout of COVID economically, as well as the health ramifications. I think it's notable that the unemployment rate at the peak of the Great Recession of 2008 was 10.6%. That was at the peak. The unemployment rate in April of 2020 was 13.3%. Really a notable and distressing increase. So one of the things that I want to ask, and this will be addressed to both of you, I'll give you both the opportunity to answer. And we know that this is the result of COVID-19, obviously, because we had a record low unemployment rate previously. But back in October of 2019, the Wall Street Journal published an article that said 2/3 of economic forecasters believed U.S. manufacturing was already in a recession. My question to you both is, how important is it to invest in workforce development, even when our economy is booming, as it seemed to be prior to COVID, rather than scrambling to invest after the fact? And I wanted your thoughts on what lessons we can learn from these experiences. What can we draw from this as we work on workforce development issues in the future? And let's start I'll just say, Ms. Chocolat, why don't you start?
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Great. So I think we can go back to the experience during the Great Recession and look at some of the lessons learned from there, because we were supporting workforce development during that period through the Recovery Act investments, which mainly flowed through existing funding streams and were very successfully implemented. A report subsequent to the Great Recession found that states and local agencies were able to expand capacity quickly to provide millions more Americans help with employment services, but also opportunities for training. In fact, the number of participants receiving training more than doubled. And despite there being so much demand for services, the share of customers receiving more intensive employment services also increased. So I think that some of the lessons for the Great Recession are that when unemployment rates are high, the opportunity cost for investing in your human capital are lower. And so for some workers who can't find a job or transfer their skills into a new job, looking at training activities may be a really good option.
Thank you. And Ms. Girard Freeman?
Representative Wild, thank you for the question. I'm going to draw a parallel in my answer to the health crisis we're facing. Would you rather have the vaccine or the disease? That's the opportunity we have. If we make investments in workforce development now, it helps us offset the crisis we see ourselves sitting in the middle of in this moment, and could help us stem the tide, quite frankly, for what's coming if we don't make these investments. What we know and what we see very clearly is that without investments in provisions like measures like improving educational outcomes, increasing basic high school levels of educational attainment, there's no way to build on the post-secondary education levels that we need. And we know that post-secondary education is one of the most important levers in moving out of, staying out of, preventing, lowering poverty, however you want to think about it. This is our chance. We will make these investments now, or we'll pay dearly for it later.
Thank you. I agree with both of you. We have two really fine community colleges in my district, and many first-gen college students attend them. The manufacturers in our district have been particularly receptive to the idea of creating programs in those community colleges where students can be trained for careers that they might not otherwise have thought of, but where the jobs are or are going to be in the future. Would you agree with me that investment in that type of partnership between industry and the schools, but with some assistance from the federal or state government, would further that ambition?
If I might,
sure,
would most certainly agree, Representative Wild, and we need look no further than Randolph Career Technical Education Center in Detroit. Representative Levin has been a colleague and an ally in that work. We put in place with local employers a strategy and a plan, and with the community, as importantly, to retool Randolph, which was previously serving as a high school, into a school that serves high schoolers during the day and uses the same equipment to train adults. That's a model for success. I would also add briefly that in Detroit, we have the benefit of having Fiat Chrysler Automotive, FCA, as a partner on the manufacturing front, along with 7 or 8, some announced, some not yet announced partners who will make parts and assemble parts. And what we've proven in Detroit is that through the workforce development system, it is possible to focus not just on young people and the jobs that the GM Hamtramck plant will need tomorrow, but also the jobs that employers like FCA have in manufacturing today. It's important that we take steps to be sure that our young people are ready, and it is important that we take steps to be sure we don't leave our adults behind. In Detroit, we have allows us to do both, but we need more funding.
Thank you very much. I yield back, Mr. Levin.
Thank you. All right, next is the gentlewoman from Georgia, Representative McBath. Lucy, you've got the floor for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Levin, and just thank you so much for convening this briefing, and thank you to Ms. Chocolat and Ms. Girard Freeman for your insight in how we come back from this crisis with a stronger, more equitable economy. Many in my district, I represent Georgia's 6th congressional district, and many around the country have been laid off or furloughed. Hundreds of thousands of people. And unemployment claims we know have climbed to over 40 million in just the last 3 months alone. We know that this level of economic upheaval will undoubtedly cause big shifts in the economy, and we need to meet those challenges directly and head on. In the long term, we need to be thoughtful. I really believe we need to be thoughtful about developing a workforce that can be successful in the economy that emerges after we come out of this crisis. There will need to be more money for training, apprenticeships, and career services. However, in the short term, we need to focus on ensuring that employers are incentivized to keep many of the people on the payroll, as many people on the payroll as possible, people that they actually had on the payroll before the pandemic, but also giving employers the flexibility to use the funds to substantiate transitional jobs or using those funds in the most impactful way. The Relaunching America's Workforce Act and the HEROES Act include this kind of flexibility to use workforce funds on transitional jobs or subsidized employment. I have questions for both of you. Ms. Chocolat, do you believe that subsidized employment is a potential strategy that states will be able to use to help workers get back to work and help public or private employers facing financial constraints and distresses?
Yeah, so subsidized employment is a strategy that some states are signaling that they will want to employ to help support workers and businesses, especially as unemployment remains high as expected. And during the Great Recession, workforce agencies in some states helped set up transitional jobs programs, which subsidized both private and public jobs. They were targeted primarily for low-income workers. States designed and implemented the program, so it was at the state level. And our members that participated in these efforts reported they were effective mechanisms. I can remember we had a workshop to kind of showcase some of them so states could share lessons learned. And in the end, they helped displace workers and workers with fewer job prospects in their immediate community. So they could also be used to help, I think now, many of the young people trying to enter the labor market. So that's definitely something that I'm sure I'm going to be hearing more from our members about.
Well, thank you. And Ms. Girard Freeman, is this a strategy that Detroit would be able to use to help mitigate the impacts of this recession?
Representative McBath, without question, the answer is yes. We have a transitional employment strategy that at present we are unable to fund. Right now, we have about fewer than 100 who are in transitional work experiences that we are paying for with a creative mix of philanthropic partner funding and as we are allowed federal funding. But 100 against an opportunity that hundreds of thousands need is it isn't even a drop in the bucket. So we have a transitional work experience strategy built out that would put thousands of Detroiters to work, and we are unable to fund it.
Let me ask you one more follow-up question on that. Have you been able to begin partnerships with the technical training schools in your communities?
We have partnerships with technical training schools, some of them for-profit, some nonprofit. We are looking forward to building stronger partnerships with our community colleges and relaunching America's Workforce Act, what you proposed as the community college grants and industry partner grants would be instrumental in that.
Okay. Thank you very much. I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Representative McBath. And now we have Representative Joe Courtney of Connecticut. Mr. Courtney, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Levin, and to both witnesses for being here today. This morning's news that another 1.5 million Americans filed unemployment claims for the first time, again, extends probably one of the most gut-wrenching records, economic history, which is now we're at 13 straight weeks of people filing first-time claims of over 1 million. And, again, it just makes sort of the happy talk that we're hearing out of the Senate, who has been sitting on the HEROES Act now for weeks, thinking that somehow we're already in a V-shaped recovery and the economy's taking off like a rocket ship, I think came out of the White House, just really the most out-of-touch, tone-deaf situation, and real people are getting hurt by the fact that we're not moving forward with the HEROES Act and legislation like the Relaunching America's Workforce Act. I'd like to again just zero in for a second with both witnesses in terms of the Relaunching America's Workforce Act provisions that again provide, I think, an opportunity for incumbent workers. Particularly in situations in Connecticut right now where businesses are starting to open, but they're opening slowly, and they either can't hire back the full complement of their workforce back in that existed back in February, or are really only able to hire people part-time. And just sort of where the flexibility that's in the Relaunch America's Workforce Act for incumbent worker job training sort of fits in as a solution for those employers who, again, oftentimes have workers that they really want to have stay connected to their jobs and not lose them. But again, just because of the fact that there's not enough work to sort of keep them employed for a full week, where again, this legislation and this funding would really sort of backfill and allow people to continue to work and obviously keep them economically whole with a full week's paycheck with subsidized funds. So again, either witnesses, Ms. Chocolat, again, just in terms of just how this legislation fits into that dilemma that, again, companies that are reopening but reopening slowly are facing right now.
Yeah, I'm wondering if you're referring to the work share program under the unemployment insurance program.
Well, that's comparable, but the
incumbent worker.
Yeah. So for the incumbent worker who are going into job training also,
okay,
because there's certainly people in healthcare and other sectors that actually, their job has actually changed because of COVID in terms of technology, et cetera.
Thank you. That helps me.
Yeah.
So as states are discussing the real need for training funds, we're hearing significant interest in funding for incumbent worker training. It provides, as you said, training grants to businesses to use to train existing employees, with the end goal being to increase the business's competitiveness. The training grants reduce business costs, which is really key for small businesses, and they help businesses retain workers or avert layoffs. And businesses that are able to invest in employees during the recession will be ahead, just like those who are investing in new technologies, because they're keeping up with the dynamics of economic change. So that provision is something that our members support.
Great. And I don't know if Ms. Girard, Freeman, you have any comment on that?
I do, Representative Courtney. Thank you for the question. Two things. So in Detroit, roughly 50% of those who are employed work for small to medium-sized businesses. And that is, as defined, those with somewhere between 2 and 50 employees. So we've had some moderate degree of success in helping small to medium-sized businesses take advantage of the payroll protection program through CARES funding. And they've had some success with that and have had some success with WorkShare. But roughly 40% of the businesses in Detroit that are Black owned are at risk of failing. And I believe that the incumbent worker training provisions as described in Relaunching America's Workforce Act would be a very important next step to helping businesses, including Black businesses, get back on their feet and pivot to be ready for and engage in the new economy otherwise.
Great. Well, thank you. I mean, I think in some ways we could rename this bill the Relaunching the America's Economy Act, because again, the benefit is obviously to employees and workers, but really it to the extent that it solves problems for employers like the ones that you both described. Again, it's a pro-growth bill, and and that's really what at some point we really need to pivot to, as we hopefully stabilize the economy at some point. So thank you, Andy. I'll yield back.
All right, thank you very much, Representative Courtney. And now I'd like to recognize the chairman of the House Veteran Affairs Committee and esteemed member of this committee, Mr. Takano of California.
Thank you, Mr. Levin. Thank you for convening this amazing panel of experts. I want to just say that over the past 3 months, about 45 million people have filed for unemployment. Economists have found that up to 42% of the recent job losses in the country will be permanent. It's imperative that Congress act quickly to support displaced workers and assist states with their workforce investment programs. During the Great Recession, labor force participation for young people ages 16 to 24 was very low, with historically high unemployment of about 1 million. And while the current job losses due to the pandemic are across the board, lower income workers and young workers will feel the greatest impact. Ms. Girard Freeman, has Detroit implemented any initiatives or programs to target young people that were not in school or working prior to the pandemic?
Representative Takano, thank you for the question. A couple of things. So before COVID-19, post Great Recession of 2008, our latest calculations showed that there were roughly 18,000 opportunity youth in Detroit, defined as young people aged 16 to 24 who were disconnected from work and school. Our strategy for opportunity youth, young people who are disconnected in the city of Detroit, is really twofold. First is reconnecting them or connecting them perhaps for the first time with opportunity through Grow Detroit's Young Talent, which is the city's summer youth employment program. We provide 8,000 opportunities to young people, paid summer opportunities every year, and there's a workforce readiness component. But opportunities for 8,000 young people in Detroit, again, as a drop in the bucket as compared to this year, the 13,000 Detroit young people who applied for the program. We are still fundraising to meet the $2.5 million gap against a $12.9 million budget for summer youth employment in the city. That's only part of the strategy for the population that you've named. The second strategy that we've launched to a much smaller degree, almost embarrassingly so, is closing the digital divide for opportunity youth. So with some generous funding from our philanthropic partners, we'll be able to provide devices, hotspots, and a year's worth of tech support to roughly 640 opportunity youth. But that's 640 opportunity youth out of a population that we know is greater than it was a couple of years ago when we measured it at 18,000. So I will say that we are grateful for the ways we may be able to creatively use funding in the CARES Act to support our young people. We're looking forward to what might be possible for supporting our young people in the HEROES Act. We are so hopeful that that moves forward, but it's not enough.
Well, as Congress works on additional relief bills, how should we assist state and local governments to ensure that they are implementing youth-friendly workforce programs? That's again, Ms. Girard Freeman, or anyone else.
I can speak from Detroit's perspective, and I think I can speak confidently for my partners across the state. It's important that we have flexibility to use funding from TANF, quite frankly, to fund summer youth employment. It's important that we have summer youth employment and year-round youth employment opportunities funded through any future measures that Congress takes. Again, we need dedicated funding and resources and the flexibility to make decisions about how that funding is implemented at the local level.
Well, thank you. Just generally for the panel, are we over reliant on privately funded training programs? What are your thoughts on that? Anybody would just want to maybe take a stab at that question?
That's not something that I'm prepared to answer. I don't have enough information, so I need to go back and gather some insights from my members and get back to you.
All right, thank you. Go ahead.
I can say that in Detroit, a couple of years ago, when I took over management or leadership of Detroit Employment Solutions Corporation, which is the Michigan Works agency, before moving into this position with the mayor's office, we were roughly 98% dependent on federal funding. And we are now 78% dependent on federal funding. We have investments from both the philanthropic community and the employer community. It's important to us to maximize every public dollar possible. We owe that to you as our leaders, and we owe that to our residents. And yet we look for partnerships with employers and don't want to become overly reliant on the philanthropic sector, because we know philanthropic partners become fatigued. So we need a better balance of employer investments. And in these times, we know that the possibility of that's pretty slim. And so that makes, quite frankly, federal and state funding all the more important to us.
Well, thank you. I actually meant for-profit, not private. I mean, there's a difference between private and for-profit. But Mr. Chairman, I want to yield back. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Giacano. And, I just, to your point about youth, I just want to remind all of us that we've already passed additional funding for the workforce system in the HEROES Act. And just to give an example of that, WIOA youth funding for program year 2020 was $35 million for the state of Michigan, to use one example. The HEROES Act would bump that up 50%, basically, adding another $21 million. And that similar kind of 50% increase, roughly, is true across WIOA adult and dislocated worker programs as well. So we really need the Senate to get in the game here and join us to get these workforce agencies the funding they need. Okay, well, panelists, the next person is someone who may represent about the hardest hit place in this country in terms of unemployment, Representative Lee of the great state of Nevada. Susie, you have the floor for the next 5 minutes.
Thank you. And I'm sorry I can't be there on video, but this is such an important briefing to have. So thank you, Chairman Levin, for doing this today. Yes, as you said, I come from the state of Nevada, and on top of the national unemployment rate of 13.3%, the unemployment rate in my home state of Nevada reached 28.2% in April, which is the worst in not only our state's history, but the worst in the country.
I want to get your pant here.
I know several other members have talked about this, using the Great Recession as a comparison, but we need to ask ourselves whether we're responding to our current crisis in a proportional manner. Think back to 2009, Congress used the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, ARA, to meet over 14 million unemployed Americans with $3.85 billion investment in the public workforce system. Fundamentally, I think we need to think critically about how we can usher in a speedy, healthy, and sustainable economic recovery. And I'm also concerned, especially being from Nevada, on how our landscape is shifting, and economists are projecting between 30 and 42% of jobs lost will not come back. So that requires us to act swiftly to prepare for this post-COVID job market. And one way that we can do this is renewing our funding for the Trade Adjustment Assistance for Community College Training Grants Program, or TACT. This is actually included in the Relaunching America's Workforce Act. And in the years following the Great Recession, educational institutions received this money through these grants and developed training programs in partnership with industry leaders and state entities. And it served over 500,000 individuals who earned over 350,000 credentials across a wide spectrum of sectors. And community colleges here in Nevada used over $24 million of this funding to train thousands of individuals. So this leads me into my first question, Ms. Chocolat. With economists predicting these shifts in the job market, and knowing that millions of Americans will need to find new employment, what role do you feel that state workforce systems play in this effort, and how helpful can grant programs like TACT be in ensuring a workforce that's ready for this new landscape?
Well, our members don't, oversee the TACT grants, but definitely, participate in them in some ways. So I don't necessarily can't speak to what my members currently think about funding TACT-like grants. That's something that we haven't discussed. But they have, NASWA has released a statement of support for Relaunching America's Workforce Act overall. So that says something right there. And as you all know, that bill proposes about $15 billion in funding for workforce and related services through these existing funding streams with a lot of flexibility. So our members are very much on board with major new investments to help us, manage the current crisis that states and local areas and all the job seekers are in.
Yeah, it is good that we've had an increase in obviously the workforce development investment over what we did through the Great Recession. What can we learn from the implementation of ARA during the recession, and how should we be applying those lessons to the policies we're looking to enact right now? This is for Ms. Chocolat again.
Okay, thank you. I think I already mentioned that, some of the successes from the Recovery Act. One that I didn't mention was that there was a separate investment in there for employment services that were targeted directly for UI claimants. It was a major change in emphasis for the workforce system nationally. And the majority of the states considered that the implementation of reemployment services for UI claimants to be a major accomplishment. The Nevada Reemployment Services Program, which was supported by the Recovery Act funds, was evaluated and found to have a very high return on investment. So Congress has invested additional funds in reemployment services, but it hasn't ramped up to the level that's going to be needed to address the current crisis. Another lesson from the Recovery Act period that I want to mention is that after the Great Recession, when the Recovery Act funds were exhausted and workforce caseloads remained high, services had to be cut back and became less intensive on average. So ensuring that any funding is available over a long enough timeline to account for all the uncertainties regarding the timing of the pandemic and the recession is going to be key. And then again, just like my panelists, states really emphasize the need for flexibility in the use of the funds. So that they can meet their state and local, their unique state and local labor market needs, and also innovate.
Thank you. Yeah, I agree. I think that very great points that you made there. I think the extension and making sure that we're making these funds available for a long enough time, but also allowing states to have flexibility to meet their unique needs. So thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Levin, and I yield.
Thank you, Mrs. Lee. And now I'd like to recognize the chairwoman of our subcommittee on workforce protections, the gentlewoman from North Carolina, Ms. Adams.
Thank you very much, Mr. Levin, and I appreciate you and Scott convening this briefing today. And thank you to our panelists for sharing their expertise. Ms. Chocolat, many workers are expressing concerns about whether it's safe to return to work. COVID-19 cases are spiking in many places, and of course, North Carolina is on that list. Due to OSHA inaction, there are inadequate measures in America's workplace. Plus, these workers are understandably worried that their unemployment insurance will be jeopardized if they fail to return to work when recalled. So given the lack of federal action on an enforceable set of COVID-19 standards for employers, how are states addressing these competing concerns, and what legislative guidance can Congress provide so that workers are not forced to choose between their health and their livelihood?
Yeah, so I represent the workforce policy side at NASWA and not the unemployment insurance policy side. So I have to actually refer that question to our unemployment insurance staff over at NASWA, and I'm more than happy to bring information back to you or have them communicate with you in some other way around those questions, which are really, really important, but not something that I've been involved in discussions on.
Okay. Ms. Girard Freeman, did you want to comment?
I can say thank you very much, Representative Adams. I can say that on the ground in Detroit, we're doing a couple of things with employers to be sure that worker concerns, as you've stated, are addressed. First, as we've gone back to market to revalidate and recruit new employers who are hiring for COVID-19 or post-COVID-19 jobs, essential workers and others, we've been very deliberate about ensuring that we collect data so that job seekers can make informed decisions if it is a human contact role and whether the employer provides PPE. It's all information that we are tracking and ensuring that our residents have so that they can, again, make informed decisions, number one, about the degree to which they are willing to have customer contact. And number two, so that we lift up for the employer community those employers who are being responsible about providing PPE for their workers and even job-seeking candidates and those who are not.
Okay, so on the employee side, though, what are you finding in Detroit in terms of workers? You know, just a few weeks ago, I had a hearing in my committee, and we brought OSHA in, and of course, we, Mr. Scott and Congresswoman Shalala and I have a bill that would provide for an emergency standard, because there are no standards right now. They've got a few rules, but they're not enforceable. And so what's happening is, or what appears to be happening, is that employees are really not being protected, yet they are considered in many respects essential. And yet they don't have it. So I'm just curious if what you've seen in your area of Detroit.
Yes, thank you for the question. So in Detroit, there is a shared reopening playbook that under the mayor's leadership, our health department and our civil rights inclusion and opportunity department developed. And so that's available to the general public, whether employers are in Detroit, in Michigan, or in other states, frankly. And it's a playbook that gives employers very clear instruction on how to reopen, safe distancing practices, how to think about using personal protection equipment, how to project the degree of protection or personal or PPE that you'll need given the kind of business that you have. We've got videos that show how employers might go through and think about the configuration of their space, informed by local epidemiologists. And then with some generous contributions from our employer community, including DTE Energy and others, Detroit gave out 6,000 PPE kits to small businesses over a 3-week period to ensure that small businesses, again, many of which are owned by people of color in the city of Detroit, have the resources they need to safely reopen.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. And thank you to both of our witnesses for being here today. And Mr. Levin, I'm going to yield back.
Thank you so much, Mrs. Adams. And now I'd like to yield to my distinguished colleague from Massachusetts, Representative Trahan. You have the floor.
Well, thank you so much, Chairman Levin, and thank you so much to the panelists. This has been so helpful. The head of the Massachusetts Retailers Association recently said that 30% of his businesses will likely never reopen. I share that because there's a growing narrative that once COVID-19 passes, everyone will just magically go back to work. And this just simply isn't going to be the case. We certainly, I join my colleagues on the committee in pushing to adequately prepare those who likely won't have a job to get into one that has longevity and good wages. The cashier, sales representative, the server, they may not have the skills to move immediately into advanced manufacturing, healthcare, or IT. That requires training, employer matching, and an awareness of market demands. With that said, so much occurs today in the digital space these days out of necessity: education, training, applications, interviews, even this briefing. But we still have a significant digital divide in this country that short circuits opportunities for all. I was so impressed to hear from Ms. Girard Freeman that you're using private philanthropy to purchase devices to close that digital divide. And in a separate context, one of our community action agencies, CTI in Lowell, Massachusetts, is using their federal CSBG dollars to do the same for our low-income young people. So I guess this question is for Ms. Chocolat. From your national perspective, do you see the digital divide as a barrier to opportunities? And if so, should our workforce boards have a role in addressing it?
Yeah, so this is a critical issue, not only for workforce and education systems, but for all government agencies in corporate America. Digital literacy and digital access issues are going to be front and center on the minds of our members during the pandemic and beyond, as everything's moving more online, and it was already on their minds. So in the workforce and education systems, it's a matter of being able to access information on our services as well as participate in the services themselves. Services like one-on-one career coaching delivered via video conferencing or virtual job fairs and online training. And if we don't provide more equitable opportunities for Americans and small businesses to gain digital literacy skills, many are going to fall further behind. Building a road that only some Americans and businesses can drive on to connect to information and people and economic opportunities. So and perhaps my fellow panelists can speak to this, but I do know that digital literacy classes are addressed in some of the one-stop workshops. So thinking about how we can continue to provide those kinds of services in the context of the pandemic and less access to the physical plant. I know some states are thinking about doing some really high need workshops, even in this scenario, by thinking very carefully about how to create a safe using protocols to create a safe space so that people can come in and actually do the workshops. But this is all, I'm just hearing, anecdotes about what states are starting to think about and do on that.
Thank you. Ms. Girard Freeman, did you want to add anything to that, or?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Representative. Briefly, I'll add that I don't want to overstate the role that philanthropy is playing in helping us close the gap. We're really grateful to have them as partners, but there is still a massive gap in Detroit for young people who are in school and out of school, and then certainly for adults. We need the provisions that start to be named in HEROES. We need greater flexibility with what was named in CARES, and we need the support of Relaunching America's Workforce Act to help us drive forward digital solutions that cover all Detroiters.
That's great. Thank you. And I was more giving a shout out to your scrappiness, not that you did not need much more support. If I have time for one more question. The American Recovery and Reinvestment Act made major investments in youth workforce activities, which we've talked about, including summer jobs, which in some cases helped create lasting summer and year-round job programs for our youth. We make similar investments in these important programs in the Relaunching America's Workforce Act. And Ms. Girard Freeman, this one is to you. I wonder if you could just describe how these funds are taken advantage of by our cities in particular.
And I'm sorry, the funds that are the HEROES funds?
The similar funds that we will be putting into the Relaunching America's Workforce Act that are designated to summer jobs for our youth.
Yes. So thank you for the clarification. We, as I mentioned earlier, we had a more than a $12 million fundraising target for young people this year, and I'm still facing a $2.5 million gap for the 8,000 opportunities we'll provide. We'd be able to we would take full advantage of the funding that's named in Relaunching America's Workforce Act. And it would be an important offset to the philanthropic funding that I'm very grateful for. I mean, quite frankly, I'm facing funder fatigue. I'm not sure that I'll be able to raise $12 million for GDYT, Grow Detroit's Young Talent, next year. I haven't even closed the fundraising gap for this year yet. And so what the funding would allow us to do is create the next level of stability for our young people, which is important on two fronts. Number one, being sure that they have the skills to connect to the rapidly changing workforce that we've all been talking about here today. And number two, to just give them a sense of hope. They're coming of age and being faced with challenges that, thank goodness many of us didn't face in the way that they are, just based on our demographics, right? We need to be more deliberate about, with our federal funding, more deliberate about solutions, pathways, and opportunities that we're providing for young people.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much. Mrs. Davis, are you wishing to be recognized?
Yes, thank you. I had to go to a markup and come back, so it got a little bit messed up, but if it's okay to just ask a question or two, that would be great.
We'd be delighted to hear your questions. Thanks. You have the floor.
Thank you so much. Ms. Chocolat and Ms. Girard Freeman, thank you so much for joining us. This is such a critically important topic, as we know, with all the disruption that we've suffered. You've addressed many issues, and my questions have asked very, very well on that. I wonder if you haven't gotten, while I had to leave, spoken about the registered apprenticeship model and the role that you see that playing. I mean, part of it is looking at our last bill on the recession and how we obviously had some successes, but we also may have had some areas that we learned a great deal from, partly because they didn't do as well as we had expected. Could you speak a little bit about the registered apprenticeship model? And again, what lessons we might take from the 2009 recovery?
Oh, Ms. Chocolat, you're muted, I think.
Since the 2009 recovery, there's been, as you know, just an upsurge in interest and activity on registered apprenticeships, so much so that our Employment and Training Committee decided that it would be good to set up a separate affinity group for all the state apprenticeship directors around the country, whether they're federal or state law apprenticeship states. So we now are running quarterly meetings, national quarterly meetings with all the apprenticeship directors who want to participate, and also the employment and training directors, to try to make sure that we're integrating WIOA and apprenticeship activities in a way that makes sure that customers have access to more information and to the apprenticeships that are available. So in terms of lessons from the Great Recession, I don't really have anything to add on that. That's not some area that I've studied and know a ton about, but I'm willing to see if I have any resources that I can share with you. But I know that prior to the pandemic, the recession, the apprenticeship activity was kind of at a high. So the baseline that the states are working with, they're starting from a very high baseline. And the performance expectations for apprenticeship, even throughout the pandemic, are still at a very high level. So there's concern about that. And there's also concern about retaining apprentices that are already in their slots. In addition to, how do you reach businesses during the pandemic to do outreach and to build the relationships that really facilitate the development of more apprenticeship slots.
Thank you. Ms. Sherrod-Freeman, did you want to add anything to that?
Representative Davis, I would briefly. One of the things we know, and I can confidently speak for my other colleagues across the state of Michigan and our workforce development system, one of the things we know for sure is that we need greater flexibility in how we use registered apprenticeships. There are so many employers who, if the process were less complicated, if the administrative side of the equation weren't so onerous, and if we had greater flexibility in having employers define what an apprenticeship looks like, we'd have greater uptake. And we think it's a critical part of the solution for the nation's recovery and certainly for Michigan's.
Thank you very much. You might not know this, but actually we were prepared to go forward with our changes as we reauthorized the 74 Registered Apprenticeship Act, and COVID preempted us actually on that. So we're hopeful to get back to that discussion because it actually addressed just what you spoke of. And we've been having many conversations. I know Mr. Levin, all of us, have been doing that. And it's astounding to me how interested people are. And so we do want to go ahead and scale this in a way that really makes sense and that makes it fluid for people to be able to do it. But the other issue that I wanted to ask really quickly about is just the readiness of our computer systems. Certainly the unemployment insurance, computer and software systems throughout our country to be able to deal with the surge that they're experiencing now. Do you see that as a major problem, and who should fund it? Where should we be going with this?
Are you asking?
Yeah, whoever would like to respond.
Yeah, so I mentioned that I do not cover the unemployment insurance side of our work. I'm on the workforce development side. So if you'd like to know more about that and what NASWA's policy proposals are on administrative funding for the UI program, I can definitely send you materials and also connect your staff and you to the in-house staff that we have focused on UI issues.
That'd be great. Thank you. Ms. Freeman, did you?
Representative Davis, I'm on the workforce development side, and we're not responsible for unemployment insurance either. But I will tell you that on the ground across the state of Michigan, and certainly in the city of Detroit, we became responsible. We had no choice except to come alongside our partners at the Unemployment Insurance Agency to try to solve for the massive structural problems that they're having with their systems. They added servers, they added staff, they trained our staff, and still it's not enough to meet the demand that they are facing. So I don't envy my colleagues in UIA. We are glad to stay alongside them, and they need more resources.
Right, I agree. Thank you so much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mrs. Davis. Well, that exhausts the time we really have for questions. I want our panelists to know that we were joined by quite a few other members who have expressed in the chat how grateful they are for this briefing, and they, some of them had meetings at 1:30 and so forth. I would just like to, in closing, ask you, either of you, if you have, if you'd like to make just a couple minutes of closing remarks. And in particular, I'd like to hold up the plight of workers, adults, people who have been disconnected, from the educational workforce systems as young people, the various people who are in need of basic adult education, in order to be able to be ready to train for anyone. For any jobs right now. They often get lost because we all want quick solutions. We want, I mean, you know, I'm a big friend and fan of your boss, Ms. Girard Freeman, the mayor of Detroit. I can only imagine how he tells you, I want this many people in jobs and so forth, right? But if I'm reading at a 7th grade level or doing math at a 5th grade level or whatever my situation might be, I'm not really ready to become an X-ray tech or whatever jobs you may have in the community there that employers need filling. So I'd like to ask each of you if you have any advice for us as we try to make policy as best we can about the needs of people, English language learners, people with numeracy or literacy challenges in this time, and whether the Relaunching America's Workforce Act is adequate in that regard, or just what you think we need to do.
So
Ms. Girard Freeman and then Ms. Chocolat.
Super. Thank you for the opportunity to make closing remarks. Thank you again for the invitation to join. I will circle back to the 3 points that I made in my opening remarks that are obviously directly tied to your good work and the work of your sponsors in Relaunching America's Workforce Act. We need maximum flexibility in how we spend at the local level. CARES was a good step in that direction. HEROES may go a step further, which is helpful, but it is not enough. I am hopeful that through Relaunching America's Workforce Act, when passed, that it certainly describes in very real terms. I got to tell you, I read the act a couple of times, and what you've named so resonates with what we need on the ground in Detroit. That's number one. Number two, we need the broader and deeper investments in the workforce system as a structure, and then in specifically initiatives and programs as named in Relaunching America's Workforce Act. We need the specifics that you lifted up in that act that didn't make it into HEROES. They are critical for the success of residents across the nation. And then lastly, I will say that we have to be driven by data, all of us, better informed by the possibilities of data in a market that is increasingly informed by artificial intelligence. We have to use artificial intelligence to inform the strategies we ought to be using it, to inform the strategies that we're building. And so I will just say that without supporting workers, young people, veterans, our returning citizens, those who are still employed, fortunately, those who are unemployed, and those who are long-term disconnected. If we don't have solutions to address every population that you've named, we don't have a solution. And if we don't have a solution, we don't have a recovery.
Thank you so much. Ms. Chocolat, you want to have the last word here as we wrap up?
Thank you. Just check on, the amount of funding and flexible funds. It will require, if we really want to help families, have economic mobility in the economy that emerges after the pandemic, it will require coordinating policies and strengthening services across workforce, education, and human services agencies. A key lesson from the Great Recession is that funding levels will determine whether, job seekers and those we want to help will have, ongoing, more intensive staff-assisted services versus have to rely on more self-service, and whether, the deeper education and training opportunities will be widely available and therefore geared toward greater outcomes, or if we'll be, only be able to stand up more limited and mostly short-term opportunities. On the data part, the data infrastructure is critical. Funds for state LMI shops have had their funding cut in real terms by over 50%. There's a lot of great work that some of the shops are doing, but not all can participate. So anything we can do to shore that up, and there are great provisions in Relaunching America's Workforce Act that provide support to state labor market information shops so that they can create more intelligence for their local areas as well as at the state level.
Well, thanks so much. Without their data, we don't really know what to do. So that's such a good point. And we also really hear you, Ms. Chocolat. You made a big emphasis on not making the mistake again that we made in during the Great Recession of having sort of a funding cliff. And so we better look into that. All right. Well, thank you both so much. This has been very enlightening for us. You've got two of our subcommittee chairs sticking with you right to the end here, as well as other members. So thank you very much. You've given us a lot of food for thought, and we look forward to working with you. And we'll have you back again. You both did a great job. Thank you so much.
Thank you to all of you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.